Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kedishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu l'suk b'divrei Torah. Varivna Adonai Eloheinu et divrei Toratcha b'finu b'fimcha beit Yisrael. ונהיה אנחנו וצאצאינו וצאצאיך בית ישראל, כולנו יודע שמך ולומדי תורתך לשמה. ברוך אתה אדוני המלמד תורה לעמו ישראל.
אמן.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר ברך בנו מכל עמים ונתן לנו את תורתו. ברוך אתה נותן התורה.
Amen.
Amen.
I'm going to quickly do one halacha so that if Kevin has to go, he's done his 2 halachas for the day. Does a paid employee do the whole benching? The reason being is that we're very particular that if somebody is paying for your time, there was a case in the Gemara where people that worked agriculturally would actually in the trees, they'd climb up the palm trees and they'd actually have to do a shortened version of Shachrit. And we're talking about some of the great Amoraim, etc., some very big sages in the Gemara and commentators would even shorten their davening if they were paid on somebody else's clock. Today, you can't get a decent employee that doesn't look on his WhatsApp and phone every 2 minutes and loses concentration. Got the attention span of an ashtray. But anyway, we're holding a different level. But here they're concerned that you're wasting somebody's time that's paying for you, which is the way it should be. And the Shulchan Aruch at section 191 and Mishnah Berurah section 191. So this is what it's basically saying. It's by Rabbi Daniel Brody. It says there was a time when employers were extremely particular that every moment of working time used to be used for work by employees. For this reason, they'll even established a shortened form of the benching, whereby the first bracha remained the same, and the next 2 were combined into one condensed bracha, and the 4th bracha of the benching was left out completely because it was the Rabbanan. However, for centuries and certainly nowadays, employers are not as strict. Well, it's kind of happy, I guess, to see that the standard hasn't suddenly dropped. It's been a slow decay. Therefore, if one eats bread during working hours, one benches as normal. One would make as zimun as usual if there are 3 people. So that doesn't go away. So, but if a person is ready to bench and the employer wants him to start soon, he need not wait for the others, even though it could cause the zimun to be lost. Now, that's a very interesting halacha. Even if the Jewish employer stipulates, and we talk about a Jewish employer here, stipulates that one may not do the full benching as it takes too long, one need not listen to him as this is already the accepted norm. Okay, so what this is seeming to distinguish with Rabbi Daniel Brody is that if he works for a Jewish person, that's why I got a surprise when I first read it, is that he can't be dictated to because a Jewish employer has to fulfill the laws of halacha, first and foremost. It's like the old question, what happens if it says honor thy mother and father, and your parents are asking you to go something against the Torah? I remember Simcha Steinhauer mentioning this in his shiur. So since his parents are both co-creators in the process and being deemed co-parents along with Hashem, Hashem is the final veto overthrowing vote, since they are also creations of Hashem. And therefore, honor thy father and mother only has to do with regards to their well-being, but not if they're going to transgress halacha. And the same thing, the honor to use the time that you're being paid for strictly only pertains to an employee who works for an employer that's also where the employer is not subject to the same halachic parameters as the other Jews. All right. Obviously, the formalities today have become more relaxed. Companies that by caring and incentivizing their staff, they will get better productivity and loyalty from them in the long run. Therefore, one must do the full benching. Okay, so we've gone a long way with Google supply psychiatrists and gyms and all sorts of other things to the Middle Ages where they used the cattle prod if you weren't awake. So, great. With that note, we're going to head straight into the Gemara. We're doing with 23b3, and we're just going to quickly fly through this because I actually want to cover a little bit of ground. So initially, all we said was that since you own the dog, whatever's in your dog's mouth is deemed your property, and therefore you're not responsible for that as the owner of that premises, inverted commas, because if something happens on your premises, the other person's transgressing. And with regards to Shane, it's not in the field of the damaged party, in inverted commas, it's on the field of the damager. And it's the same thing with regards to Karen. It seems to propose here that if your hand's in the mouth of the dog, it's almost as though it entered your premises. But the Gemara is going to contradict this because what did it say? At the end of the day, you are responsible for that Karen damage. In other words, if your animal bites somebody, you're responsible for the damage. And that proves that according to Shane, you can't consider the mouth of the animal to be the damaged party's property or possession. That was the proof in Sanhedrin. Just one thing to note, the only reason they use the example of an insider is we're dealing with a third party. And when we're dealing with somebody that's mentally incompetent or a minor or somebody that isn't able to see consequence of action, because anytime a human being can see consequence of action by a direct piece of damage, direct, not when you're inciting and it's grammar indirect, and not where you've damaged somebody, because that's a case of malware, but a case where somebody that's incompetent incites and puts food in an animal's mouth is equivalent to an inciter, which just psychologically gets the animal worked up. It's not where it actually damaged it directly, because the dog has a mind of its own. Kevin quite rightly said yesterday, is that, doesn't the dog have its own sort of thoughts? And that's exactly why that the owner is responsible for the animal. Just like if your animal goes rogue and gores somebody, the owner is responsible because the dog doesn't have dice. And that's why it's using that example. Rabbi Cohen said in Tosfot, when somebody that's feeble-minded or not doesn't have the capacity of consequence puts food in the dog mouth. This is not the standard case of Shane. I do think in the Schottenstein it should have mentioned it. At no point did it mention it. No point. And that did add to the confusion. So now on the 23b1, we're saying as follows. We're just going to we're actually going to the case of Sanhedrin. And it says that the Gemara actually rejects the proof, because you could say that the Mishnah there means that even the inciter is not liable. So let me just tell you what we learned. In the first case, we learned that the inciter is not liable because it didn't use the expression they. If it used the expression they, it would imply that both the inciter and the owner of the dog is not liable. The very fact that it said the inciter is not liable inferred the fact that the owner of the dog must be liable. And if the owner of the dog is liable, it means that if he's liable for Karen damage, then the mouth of the dog is not the damages party's property. Otherwise, you wouldn't be liable for anything that was in your premises. So that was the proof from Sanhedrin. And now it's saying on the next page of the Gemara of Sanhedrin, listen, that actually is rejected. Because according to Rashbad, okay, it's basically saying that it's using the term that the Mishnah means there that even the inciter is not liable. I just want you guys to unmute 1 second, 1 sec. Guys, just unmute. Okay, can you hear me? So Michael asked a question the other day, which I thought, Michael, we all shared this, not just you. I'm sure Kevin, Gavin, myself, and Arthur, is how the heck, if somebody takes your animal for a walk, say you've got a person that you hire to give your dog. Let me turn my phone off. Sorry about this, guys. Sorry, guys. Say you've got somebody that walks your dog, and that person walks animals for a living and decides that he's got an irritation with his next door neighbor, and he takes your dog for a walk, but he knows that you've got killer American pit bulls. So he wants to just toy with the neighbor, and he just and it's going to look like a Homer Simpson episode. I don't know if you've ever seen Homer Simpson, where Burns turns around and says, release the dogs. And there's nothing left of Homer Simpson. Whenever Homer Simpson wants a raise, or anybody from the Acme nuclear plant wants a raise, Burns and Smithers release the dogs, and there's nothing left of the person. I'm sure you guys have seen that. So you've hired this person to take your dog for a walk, but he sees your dog's got teeth and some other wonderful properties to release on his next door neighbor that's been ticking him off for months. So the next thing you get this call that somebody's in the RCU because they've been all fanged up from the dog, and they want to hold you responsible. What's the obvious answer, as Michael said? You're not responsible. How the heck can you be responsible for a third party using your property to damage? It's impossible. So that's what it says in the Gemara, and the commentary is brought by Rashbad. So what it's saying here is that even the inciter is not liable, which means that the owner of the dog is certainly not liable. So the Tana might have considered it obvious that the master is not liable either, and therefore needed only to state that the inciter is not liable in this case. This is according to Ravad and Rashba. So what it's saying is exactly as Marco said. The default position is that the owner of the animal, when a third party uses it for nefarious means, is never responsible. But here it's even coming to say the inciter is not responsible.
Dan?
Okay. Yeah?
Isn't it theft?
No, because we're talking a case where you allowed the person to walk your
Are you
dog.
allowed? Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's what I'm saying. That's why I used that example. The Gemara doesn't use that example of a dog walker. But you're busy at work and you want your pets to get exercise. Okay, so that's why I used that example. So that's obviously that's the one rejection of the proof. There's a second rejection of the proof. The one is, and if you prefer to say that the Mishnah does not refer to where the dog bit him, but where the animal stuck its fangs out of its mouth and lacerated the injured party. So what are we saying here? We're saying that you can't derive a proof from here at all. Because if you want to say that the dog's mouth is open and the person got the dog just lacerated his arm with the dog teeth, then that's not in the premises of the dog's mouth, because it's the mouth gaping open where the teeth lacerated the person. So what it's saying from this Gemara is we don't seem to have a proof of saying whether the mouth of the animal is the dog owner's property or not. Because according to the second rejection, if the animal's mouth is open and the teeth lacerated the person, in that particular case, that doesn't prove that the mouth of the animal isn't the damager's property. Because to say that the owner isn't liable, if you don't want to say he's not liable anyway, and that's a given, and you want to say he could be liable, because you don't know if he never looked like the neighbor either. It's still not a proof either way, because the second rejection proves that it could be the mouth of the animal belonging to the damager or the damager's premises or yard. And the first rejection of proof is saying that, listen, obviously a third party who actually owns the dog isn't aware of what was done here. And therefore, that's why we make, therefore, we don't make the owner of the dog liable. Okay? So that's a proof to say that it could be the mouth of the dog being the damager's party, but it's the reason for the fact that it's not his fault or that there was a pure laceration. Whereas the initial proposal by the Gemara is the inciter is not liable, and if it says they are not liable, it's saying that if the inciter is not liable, in other words, he is not liable. The term was he is not liable. So if the next statement in the Gemara is proposing the inciter is not liable, it's proposing that the owner of the dog is liable, and therefore, if he's liable, it would say that the animal's mouth is not the dog owner's prop premises. Otherwise, the dog's owner would not be liable. So all you got to deduce from this proof in Sanhedrin is that there's no proof for or against the dog's mouth being the damager or the damaged party's yard. That's all it says. It doesn't seem to have any conclusive basis. It's going to just quickly go into a discussion of Sanhedrin because it often does that. It goes off on a tangent and teaches you something with Sanhedrin. So just kind of roll with it for a minute, okay? So in Sanhedrin, it says the following. The Gemara seeks to resolve this query from a different source because it's saying it's still now up in the air. We don't know if the animal's mouth is basically belonging to the damaged party's premises or the damager's premises. How's the mouth of the dog seen? Only when a mentally incompetent person has put food in the dog's mouth. That's what we're saying. It's not the classic case of shame. So the rest of the Gemara is trying to answer this, and it says as following. Come learn a proof from the very next section of the Mishnah just cited. If he stabbed the fangs of the snake into the flesh of the victim, killing the victim with the snake bite, Rav Yehuda rules him liable to the death penalty, whereas the sages rule that he is not liable. Okay? And Rav Acha Bar Yaakov said regarding this dispute between Rav Yehuda and the sages, when you analyze this dispute, you're going to conclude, according to the opinion of Rav Yehuda, a snake's venom stands with its fangs, and that's when one presses the fangs into the victim's flesh, he directly injects him with poison. Therefore, the stabber is liable to execution by the sword, and the snake is not liable to execution. According to the sages, however, the snake secretes its venom on its own after its teeth pierce the victim's flesh. Therefore, the snake is put to death for stoning, and the stabber is not liable for execution. So let me just explain to you what it's trying to say here. Rav Yehuda is basically saying that as far as that's concerned, that let me just put it in the most simple way, is that they say that the snake has got two different pieces of anatomy in terms of reaction. So Rav Yehuda says as follows, right, is that the reason why the inciter is liable to the death penalty is because when a snake bites somebody, he's talking about when a case bites somebody, that the venom is already within the snake's mechanism to inject the victim. In other words, if we're talking about a snake here, there's two possibilities. The snake will kill you with its venom, or the second thing of it is the snake will bite a person and they will be struck with the venom, but the snake has the decision whether to inject the venom or not. So according to Rav Yehuda, the person that uses the snake is liable to the death penalty. Okay. Why? Because it's basically Rav Yehuda saying that the person got the snake to bite the person and made sure that the venom was secreted into the person. Okay, because it was a natural response that venom is secreted the minute the snake gets aroused. So if you want to hold that the default position of a snake's anatomy is the minute it bites you, it is involuntary whether the poison comes out or not. And it's not a snake that can choose to retract the poison or not. You have basically given the person a death sentence. It's the equivalent of basically injecting them with cyanide. And therefore, according to Rav Yehuda, the person is liable to the death penalty, and it's not the snake's fault because the snake made no decision in its anatomy and did not kill the person. The person used the snake as a tool. The sages basically say that the inciter is not liable to the death penalty, okay, because the snake secretes venom on its own after the teeth has pierced the victim. Meaning that in not all cases or not all breeds of snake does the snake automatically secrete enough toxins to kill the victim. And that depending on how aggravated the snake is, it's the snake's physiological discretion whether or not it's what do you call it, injects enough toxic lethal venom in or not. So since it's the snake's choice, and it's not an automatic process where a person automatically dies, the person is not liable to execution, because it's equivalent to where he injured the person and sent them to hospital for maybe a mild form of poisoning and certainly a nasty life experience. But it's not necessarily guaranteed that the person dies. And
Dan, Dan,
yeah,
sorry, sorry. Okay, great, fine. But I mean, the snake would never be in that position if the insider didn't put the snake in that position. Yeah. So, I mean, this logic just doesn't make sense. I mean, the snake would be crawling around, but for the fact that this guy picked up the snake and pierced the arm of somebody else, and now you're debating whether the snake is actually, I
okay. So
mean,
I tell you why they're so careful here. On laws of damages, they're not as cautious. You're giving somebody here the death penalty. So imagine a case where you get two guys at
okay,
say the guy, let me just give you another example. Say the guy wants to just let me just set in an example. You're nodding your head, Michael. You're on mute. Just unmute yourself.
now my son came in here and asked me a question, and I got disturbed. It's just I'm listening.
Okay. So what I'm
Okay.
saying is as follows. Say I'll give you the perfect example. Say I want to collect money from somebody and I want to scare them, but my intention is not to kill them in any manner, shape, or form. I just take two bouncers with me to try and smash a person up a bit to scare them into paying money because they owe a fortune of money, and I've sent them legal letters and I've sent them everything and they're not responding. And um, uh, uh, one of the guys, when my guy owes me money, um, one of the bouncers pushes the other guy. Then the other guy hits the bouncer. Now the bouncer gets very annoyed and he hits the guy and he goes through a coffee table and hits the corner of his head on a marble unit. Okay. So now we've got two issues. We've got an issue of groma, which is indirect murder. Again, I bought the two bouncers to do grievous bodily harm. Grievous bodily harm. Yeah, I never did it directly. We learned in Sanhedrin, many cases, Gavin and I, that if there's indirect murder, the Sanhedrin cannot give a death penalty. In other words, if you put somebody in a pit and they starve to death or they thirst to death, okay, then the elements have gotten to them. They've died of malnutrition. Is Hashem going to hold you responsible, B'dai Shemayim? Absolutely. Can the Sanhedrin convict you? No. If you even hire a hitman with a, say you're not even going to, it's a bad example I used to go and send people to rough somebody up. If you take somebody and you hire a professional hitman to kill the person, the Sanhedrin cannot give you the death penalty under the law of Groma, indirect murder. But because the person that killed this other person for money knew, even non-Jewish people know that there's a rule saying thou shalt not murder. People of every religion know thou shalt not murder. He chose for money to murder. Therefore, the person that's actually caused the direct murder gets the death penalty. That's even with a person with dice. Here you're talking about a snake with no common sense. Okay? So even if I had to contract and get somebody to murder somebody else, that person would get the death penalty as the executor, the hitman, etc. I would not. In Shemaim, I would be fully responsible for that sort of action. Okay.
Right.
So Kal v'chomer, how much more so when you incite a snake, which doesn't have any brains or common sense, that's indirect, that we generally don't give the death penalty if the snake has a will of its own as to whether or not to inject enough poison. If it is a given that with the anatomy of the snake that when it bites a person dies unconditionally, that will happen, that it's, in other words, the fangs are like a syringe, enough poison will come out like a black mamba and the person dies, guaranteed. Okay, in that case, it's as if you've used the weapon yourself. Okay, and Rav Yehuda says there you've used a weapon, and the person that's used that weapon gets the death penalty. The reason the snake does not get the death penalty is because the snake, it was an involuntary act from the snake. It was anatomy talking. It was pure anatomy, and the snake's not at fault. Now, why do we kill a poor defenseless animal? Well, it's not a poor defenseless animal. I watched a documentary in the Kruger Park that when lions in Kenya used to, in colonial days, used to hunt people when they got a taste for human meat, they would make sure that lion was shot because it would go to where the English were fighting, in cases in Kenya or the Boer War, whatever, and they would get a taste for human flesh on the battlefield, and then they would start hunting humans. And in that case, they would take a lion that developed a taste for human flavor, even today, and they would have it shot. So even an animal like a gorilla that could pose a danger, etc. Today they've got techniques where they can use a, what do you call it, a dart to make the animal unconscious and stick it in a zoo. But if you don't have that sort of drug, then many times they'd remove a dangerous animal so it wouldn't create further hazard or possible death to the human population. So all Rav Yehuda is saying is that a snake, like a black mamba, will kill. And therefore, whoever uses that snake is liable just as if he stabbed a person and is liable to the death penalty. The snake shouldn't get executed. It's not the snake's fault. It has nothing to do with the snake. The rabbis say that there's not enough toxicity to kill a person. So if the snake killed the person, we get rid of the snake. We kill the snake just simply because we don't want a snake that's particularly hazardous or aggressive to ever get out there again, and we get rid of the snake. But the person doesn't get the death penalty. The reason being is it's not a direct murder. It's insufficient to have killed the person because the person, they might have died, but in most cases, there would be two factors that would be taken into account. It used this example in Sanhedrin with the case of poison arrows. They say if you shoot somebody with a poison arrow and they don't die on impact, but it takes a few days for the poison, but you fail to give them the remedy to cure them of that poison, is that considered the death penalty? In other words, failure to act. If somebody is drowning, failure to help save them. So in this particular case, the rabbis say he's not liable to the death penalty because it's a suffix as to whether or not the snake would have killed the person. It just so happened maybe this guy had a low immunity, or the snake in this case chose of its own volition to excrete enough poison to kill. Does that make sense? And because the Sanhedrin is always very sensitive to not giving unnecessary death penalties, they look for what you call exonerating circumstances. And the rabbis are saying if the exonerating circumstances and the animal has any sort of free choice in terms of the amount of toxicity of poison to inject, in that particular case, the animal is also liable. So the snake gets the death penalty because we don't want a toxic, aggressive snake running around, but the person does not get the death penalty. Believe me, he'll probably get fined and he's going to be a social pariah. Nobody's going to want to spend quality time with him, but they're very reticent just to give the death penalty. Now, we've got 6 minutes left. I know Kevin has to go.
Yeah.
I think we can end off on this note early. I think we covered a lot of ground. And I want to thank you guys for coming.
Thanks, man.
Thanks, Tim.
All right.
Thanks,
Well, guys.
Thanks,
Thanks, bud.
guys.